Was communism a workers' paradise or a nightmare for nations? From the sparks of 19th century philosophical ideas to revolutions, wars, and collapses, this is a story of ideals, oppression, and an uncertain future. Communism was one of the most influential political and economic ideologies of the 20th century. It drew millions into the streets, ignited revolutions, built empires, and eventually brought many of them to ruin. But what is communism really? Where did it begin? And why did it have such a profound impact on world history? In this comprehensive narrative, we'll explore the philosophical roots of communism, the role of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the authors of the Communist Manifesto, and how their ideas laid the foundation for a global movement. We'll trace the rise of the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution, the global expansion of communism in China, Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea, and finally the collapse of communist regimes and the legacy they left behind. A story that began with dreams of justice and equality, but often ended in oppression, corruption, and collapse. Join us as we trace the journey of communism from its birth to its present-day echoes. It all began in the dark, smoky cities of 19th century Europe. Factories roared day and night. Steam-powered machines devoured coal. Chimneys spat out thick black smoke into gray skies. On the ground, the streets were crowded with exhausted men, women, and even children, emerging from the factories with soot on their faces and hunger in their eyes. This was the new world, the Industrial Revolution. For the wealthy, it was a golden age. New industries, new profits, new empires. But for the workers, life was brutal. Long hours, low wages, cramped housing, no safety, no rights. Amid this chaos, two men sat in a small, dimly lit apartment in Brussels. One was a philosopher, Karl Marx, intense, sharp, and uncompromising. The other, Friedrich Engels, a factory owner's son who had turned against his own class after witnessing the suffering of workers firsthand. Together they wrote, not poems, not novels, but a blueprint for revolution. They studied history and claimed they had discovered a pattern. That all of history, from ancient times to modern cities, was a story of class struggle. That every society had been divided, slave and master, serf and lord, worker and boss. And they believed that capitalism, the engine driving this modern world, would eventually consume itself, that it was unstable, that it created inequality so extreme, it would spark a rebellion. In 1848, as revolutions swept across Europe, they released their boldest work yet, the Communist Manifesto. It was short, only about 30 pages, but its message was explosive. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. The manifesto argued for a world without private property. No landlords, no kings, no money, no state. Just a classless society where the means of production belonged to the people. All the people. To some, it was a vision of justice, a paradise. To others, it was a nightmare, a threat to civilization itself. But either way, the words of Marx and Engels would echo across continents and through centuries. At first, they were ignored. But one day in a different land, under different conditions, their ideas would be turned into action. Real revolutions were coming, and communism was about to leave the page and step into reality. Years had passed since the Communist Manifesto was published. Marx was dead. Engels had grown old. But their ideas had not faded. Far from the smoke-filled factories of Western Europe, an ancient empire was on the brink of collapse. The Russian Empire. In the early 20th century, Russia was ruled by the czars, absolute monarchs who held power like gods. The nation was drowning in poverty, corruption, and inequality. Millions of peasants had no land. Urban workers toiled in brutal conditions. In this chaos, a small but determined group of revolutionaries began to rise. Men and women who had read Marx, believed in his vision, and were ready to turn theory into action. At the center stood a man named Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was not just a thinker, but a ruthless political strategist. He took Marxism, reshaped it for Russia's unique conditions, and forged something new, what he called revolutionary communism. In 1917, while World War I was tearing the country apart, the revolution began. First came the February Revolution. The people overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. Then just months later came the October Revolution. Lenin and the Bolshevik Party seized power. For the first time in history, a real communist government was born. No longer just theory, no longer just words on paper. Communism was now in control. In the streets, in the courts, in the military. Lenin promised land for the peasants, work for the workers, peace for the people. But very quickly, the dream began to bleed. To maintain power, the Bolsheviks crushed free speech, shut down newspapers, executed opponents. A brutal civil war erupted, and Russia descended into violence. Yet the Bolsheviks prevailed, and in 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was officially born, the world's first communist state. To supporters around the globe, it was a victory, proof that Marx's ideas could build a real system. But it was only the beginning. The dream of a classless society had now become the mission of a powerful state. And the question hung in the air: can you build freedom through dictatorship? Can communism survive without violence and repression? The answer would soon unfold in the next chapter of this story. Lenin's death in 1924 left a vacuum, a dangerous silent battle for power. And from the shadows, one man emerged, Joseph Stalin. He was not a brilliant orator. He was not a grand philosopher. But Stalin was something far more dangerous, a master of control. Quietly, systematically, he outmaneuvered his rivals inside the Communist Party. And by the late 1920s, he had full control of the Soviet Union. But this was not the future Marx had dreamed of. Stalin's version of communism was brutal, authoritarian, and unforgiving. He launched a campaign called collectivization, forcing millions of farmers to surrender their land to the state. The goal was to create massive government-controlled farms. But the result? Catastrophe. Millions died in famines, especially in Ukraine. Families starved, entire villages vanished. And when people resisted, Stalin responded with fear. He built a terrifying secret police, the NKVD, and unleashed a wave of purges. Teachers, soldiers, artists, even Communist Party members. No one was safe. People disappeared in the night. They were accused of being enemies of the people, tortured and executed or sent to labor camps called gulags. By the late 1930s, Stalin ruled not by ideology, but by terror. Yet despite the horror, the Soviet Union was transforming. Massive factories rose from the ground. Steel, oil, and machinery poured from the east. To outsiders, it seemed like progress, a powerful alternative to capitalism. But behind the factories were ghosts, millions of lives lost for the sake of the state. This was communism. Not as Marx had imagined it, but as Stalin had forged it. A state with absolute control, built on fear, blood, and silence. The year was 1945. World War II had ended, but the world was not at peace. Two superpowers stood tall amid the ruins, the United States and the Soviet Union, and between them a new kind of war had begun. The Cold War. It wasn't fought with tanks and bullets, at least not directly. It was a war of ideas, of ideology. Capitalism versus communism, freedom versus control, democracy versus the party. The Soviet Union saw itself as the heart of a global revolution. It wanted to spread communism to every corner of the earth, not just as politics, but as salvation. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies believed communism was a threat to freedom, to markets, and to individual rights. So the world split into two camps. A curtain of fear, the Iron Curtain, fell across Europe. In the East, Moscow led communist regimes. In the West, liberal democracies backed by America. From Berlin to Korea, from Vietnam to Cuba, the Cold War turned nations into battlegrounds. In China, Mao Zedong led a massive communist revolution, bringing 1/5 of humanity under red rule. In Cuba, Fidel Castro overthrew a dictator and aligned with the USSR, just 90 miles from Florida. In Vietnam, America fought a brutal, unwinnable war to stop the spread of communism. Spies, propaganda, nuclear missiles, shadow wars, all part of this high-stakes game. And yet, while the Soviets promised equality and brotherhood, their empire often relied on force and fear. In Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, when people rose up for freedom, Soviet tanks crushed them. The world lived under the shadow of a mushroom cloud, and for decades, humanity held its breath. This was no longer just Marx's dream. This was a global contest of power, paranoia, and survival. The Cold War would define an entire era and leave behind scars that still shape our world today. In the heart of China, amid poverty, warlords, and foreign invasion, a new force was rising. Born in 1893 to a peasant family in Hunan province, Mao Zedong began life far from power. But he was a thinker, and more than that, a fighter. Inspired by Marx and Lenin, Mao believed China's salvation lay not in emperors or merchants, but in the hands of peasants, the millions of poor, overlooked villagers across the vast countryside. He joined the Chinese Communist Party in its infancy, and by the 1930s, Mao had become its most charismatic leader. But China was already at war, not just against Japan, but within itself. The communists and nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fought a brutal civil war. When the communists were nearly defeated, Mao led them on the legendary Long March, a 9,000-kilometer retreat across mountains, rivers, and deserts. It was harsh. Thousands died, but Mao survived and became a symbol of unbreakable will. After World War II, the Civil War reignited, and in 1949, Mao's forces emerged victorious. He declared the birth of the People's Republic of China, standing atop the gates of Tiananmen and shouting, "China has stood up." But victory was only the beginning. Mao sought to transform China, fast and radically. His first grand experiment was the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962, a push to industrialize through rural communes. But it was a disaster. People were forced into collective farming, steel was smelted in backyard furnaces, and famine followed. Tens of millions died, yet the government hid the truth, and Mao refused to admit failure. Then came another storm, the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. Mao, fearing the party had grown too soft, unleashed the youth, Red Guards, to purge bourgeois ideas, attack intellectuals, destroy temples, rewrite history. China descended into chaos. Teachers were humiliated, books were burned, families torn apart. Old China was smashed in the name of revolution. And yet for many, Mao remained a godlike figure. His face adorned posters. His words filled little red books. His image, larger than life, hovered over a nation torn between devotion and trauma. When he died in 1976, millions wept, but the scars remained. Mao had changed China forever, not just its politics, but its soul. And he left behind a legacy both worshipped and feared. When Mao declared the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Soviet Union was the first major power to recognize it. To Mao, the USSR was more than an ally. It was a model, a mentor, a big brother in the global communist struggle. Stalin welcomed China into the communist bloc. He sent engineers, scientists, military advisors, and in return, China pledged loyalty to the socialist cause. The early 1950s were a time of close collaboration. Soviet blueprints were used to build China's factories. Thousands of Chinese students studied in Moscow. Chinese military relied heavily on Soviet weapons and training. But beneath the surface, tensions were growing. Mao didn't want to be anyone's puppet, not even Stalin's. And after Stalin's death in 1953, the relationship began to shift. Nikita Khrushchev, the new Soviet leader, denounced Stalin's brutality and called for peaceful coexistence with the West. To Mao, this was weakness, betrayal. He believed revolution required permanent struggle, not compromise. By the early 1960s, the two giants were no longer allies. Border clashes erupted. Propaganda flew. Each accused the other of betraying true communism. The Sino-Soviet split had begun, a deep ideological and geopolitical divide that fractured the communist world. China charted its own path, more radical, more agrarian, more centered on Mao's cult of personality. The USSR followed a more industrial, bureaucratic, and state-led model. The dream of a united communist world shattered, not by capitalism, but by division within. And yet the rivalry between China and the Soviet Union would shape global politics for decades. From Vietnam to Africa, from Cuba to Korea. Two superpowers born from the same ideology, but destined to walk separate roads, and sometimes to clash. The Soviet Union once stood as a giant, a nuclear-armed superpower stretching across 11 time zones, claiming to represent the workers of the world. But beneath its towering image, cracks had long begun to show. The 1970s and 80s brought stagnation. While the West surged ahead in technology, economy, and innovation, the Soviet bloc struggled with shortages, corruption, and fear. The five-year plans were failing, the factories were outdated, and the people disillusioned, tired, controlled. By the 1980s, the Soviet dream was suffocating under its own weight. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, young, bold, and different. He introduced two powerful ideas: perestroika, economic restructuring; glasnost, openness and transparency. For the first time, people could criticize the government. Newspapers told the truth. Books once banned were now published. People began to dream of freedom, not just in whispers, but in the open. But freedom is a wildfire, and Gorbachev couldn't contain it. In Poland, the Solidarity movement rose. In East Germany, crowds demanded to tear down the Berlin Wall. In Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, revolutions sparked like dominoes. By 1991, the unthinkable happened. The hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. 15 new countries emerged from its ruins. Russia was no longer the heart of a communist empire. It was lost, confused, and capitalist. And around the world, communist regimes began to fall like collapsing towers. Cambodia, Albania, Ethiopia. Only a few remained: Cuba, North Korea, and China, which now embrace capitalism in everything but name. The dream of a global communist revolution had faded. What remained were questions. Was Marx wrong? Did power corrupt even the ideal of equality? Or was the dream simply ahead of its time? The story of communism wasn't over, but the world that gave birth to it had changed forever. Communism didn't conquer the world, but it changed it forever. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, the impact of communist thought can be felt in almost every corner of the modern world. Let's begin with the working class, the very heart of Marx's vision. In the 1800s, workers in Europe and America had little to no rights. 12-hour shifts, child labor, no sick leave, no safety protections, no retirement. But with the rise of communist movements, even in countries that never became communist, governments were pressured to act. To avoid revolution, they granted reforms: minimum wages, labor unions, paid holidays, healthcare systems, pensions, limits on working hours. Ironically, capitalism became more humane because communism scared the elites into compromise. So even in defeat, communism forced change. But what about the countries that did go all in? In the USSR, China, Cuba, and others, communism brought rapid industrialization. Literacy rates soared, women entered the workforce, land was redistributed, hunger was fought. Some nations were pulled out of feudal poverty into modernity, but the cost was enormous. Famines caused by failed policies, mass arrests, gulags, totalitarian regimes, no free elections, no independent media, a state that owned everything and controlled everyone. The dream of Marx, a stateless, classless paradise, became in many cases a nightmare of state surveillance and repression, because Marx envisioned a world built from the bottom up by the workers themselves. But in reality, most communist states were built from the top down, by parties, by force, by power. It wasn't communism, it was authoritarianism in the name of communism. And yet, something remained. In today's world, ideas born in Marx's time still echo: the fight for worker dignity, for housing, education, and healthcare as basic rights, for a society where profit doesn't outweigh humanity. In some places like Scandinavia, these ideas evolved into social democracy, a blend of capitalism with socialist values. And in others, they fueled anti-colonial struggles, liberation movements, and visions of a better world. So was communism a failure, or was it simply unfinished? That's not a question history can answer. It's a question for us, because the story of communism didn't end in the 20th century. Its ghost, or its inspiration, still walks beside us today. Karl Marx dreamed of a better world, a world where workers weren't just tools for profit, where no man owned another, where equality wasn't just an idea, but a way of life. But history is never that simple. The communism that Marx imagined was democratic, decentralized, and born from the will of the working class. The communism that emerged in the 20th century was something different, forged by revolutions, ruled by parties, enforced by power. Let's start with the positives, because there were many. Where communism took hold, illiteracy was often wiped out. In Cuba, literacy rose from 60% to nearly 100% in a few years. In the USSR, schools were free, women entered universities, and art and science flourished. In Mao's China, millions of peasants were educated for the first time. Hospitals reached the countryside. Landlords lost power. Hunger declined, at least at first. Communist governments promised dignity to the poor and often delivered. Housing was cheap or free, work was guaranteed, healthcare was public. Education was a right, not a privilege. And perhaps most importantly, These governments challenged the global dominance of Western colonial powers. They gave voice to the global South, to the oppressed, to the forgotten. But the cost of these promises was high. In Stalin's USSR, dissent meant death, or a gulag. In Cambodia under Pol Pot, intellectuals were executed en masse. In Mao's China, the Cultural Revolution turned children against their teachers, families against themselves. Freedom was sacrificed for equality, and often neither truly existed. So what of the working class? Did communism help them? Absolutely, in ways often ignored. Even in the capitalist West, workers gained rights because of the communist threat. 8-hour workday, workplace safety laws, paid sick leave, labor unions, social security. Not because capitalists were generous, but because they were afraid that their own people might rise up. So in a strange twist of history, communism improved capitalism by pushing it to reform. And yet Marx's dream remains unfulfilled. He imagined a world without a ruling class, without states, without prisons. But communism often replaced one ruling elite with another, one kind of oppression with a different one. So was it a failure? Maybe, but it also gave us something real. A new way to look at power, a voice for the voiceless, a challenge to a world built only on profit. Today, in the age of billionaires, climate collapse, and rising inequality, the questions Marx asked still matter. The answer